All right, awesome. Okay, so if you are listening to the sound of my voice right now, that means that you're somebody that's offered to either help give me any comments on this presentation before I actually go live with it at the summit here next week in Houston, or you're just trying to learn more about TypeScript. So welcome to both of you. But that's the purpose of this is to me to see how this is going to go. This whole presentation is basically me taking 10 years worth of, or six-ish years worth of TypeScript knowledge, 10 years worth of dynamic CRM knowledge, and a solid 2 to 3 weeks this spring trying to figure out how do I get as much typing into my web client based model forms and stuff as possible, as quickly as possible, as easily as possible, and sharing that with everyone else. So I don't know how that's going to look trying to condense all that into 40 minutes, but we will give it a shot. Here we go. First thing is the project setup. This is never exciting, but this is something that you're going to have to do as a developer. Hopefully nothing here is different or strange. Hopefully you've used NPM before. If you've not used NPM before, not used Node.js, you need to download that. And that's the whole like center of the current JavaScript world. Like that is what everybody, all the cool kids, I'm not a cool kid anymore. I stopped being that, I guess, when I got over the age of 35 or something, but all the cool kids with all their little, nice spiky hair and whatever, they're the ones that are using Node.js and NPM, and so that's where the center of the JavaScript world, and that's where everything else is being pushed to as well. So that's what we're going to be using here, what I'm going to be using. So if you don't have that, install that from nodejs.org. VS Code, if you're a huge Visual Studio fan, I understand not wanting to switch from Visual Studio to VS Code, but I have found that it is way lighter than Visual Studio is, and just seems to work a lot better for what we need to do for the web-based client-side version of things. And so, yeah, highly recommend using that. That's what I'm going to be using and running everything out of. Again, you don't have to do it. Everything should work in Visual Studio because it's all command line based. The only thing that would be maybe a little bit different is ESLint may have to be configured slightly different. I don't know how much support there is for Visual Studio for ESLint, but I will be using ESLint. Again, you don't have to. I'll get into what that is later. Yeah, so just VS Code installed and get the ESLint extension installed. Those are the only extension. That's the only extension for VS Code that I'm going to be bringing up. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of other ones. There's some Git ones you probably need to be using, but I'm just trying to do the bare minimum here. And then finally, the weird part here is the NuGet.exe. Normally, NuGet's going to be for your C# projects. In this case, the tool that I'm using for generating the actual TypeScript definitions is on NuGet. I did see it actually is on NPM as well, but that wasn't listed in their documentation, and I didn't go through that. So all my steps are in NuGet.exe steps for getting that to work. And so, yeah, so you could, if you say, hey, I hate NuGet and I want to not use that, then you can look to use it in NPM. Yeah, so that's just what I've used. That's what I saw the documentation for, and that's what I will walk through today. The first thing that we're going to want to think about here is, where do you put this stuff? Where do you start your project? And so I use this naming convention a lot here, but I'll kind of walk through here. First, we have our client name. So if you are working as a consultant and you have multiple clients, great. This is what you definitely need to have one of these folders in here. I normally put like a C dev _dev here, so it's the very first thing in my root directory at the very top. But then after that, I'll put a client name here. So if I'm working for Acme Corp or for Consoto or whatever it happens to be, I have a client name there just to keep those things separate and not having any naming collisions based on the client. And then underneath that, I'll have the Git root. Normally, this is actually defined for you in Azure DevOps for what that Git or the TFS root actually is named. So that way, if you happen to have more than one source control of the repository you're connecting to for that client, you have those different names in there. So that's the Git root. And then internal to that, you may have some other functions or other folders in here that you may have to worry about as well. Someone may say, oh, you're under Division 1, East Coast, whatever. But for this case, I'm just going to assume that you have just one folder here that's going to be like your internal name for your Dataverse. Maybe this is Sales App or whatever happens to be. For now, I'll just list it as Dataverse, but that's going to be like, hey, everything that's specifically related to Dataverse is in this folder. So you'd have that in there as well. And then this web one here, again, this is optional for me. When I go through and I create my my projects, I like to have the my client code, my client web forms separate from my plugins. So that's why I have a web. If I were to develop maybe some PCF controls, I might put those in a separate folder as well, because those PCF controls I want to try to treat like a community project where I'm building those and pushing those in its own separate thing and managing that separately than the actual like main solution, if that makes sense. Because I want those to be kind of like, hey, it's a plain control, it doesn't have any dependencies, anything else. All my code depends on it rather than the other way around. So that's why I have a web here. You don't have to do it that way, but you can. And that's what I recommend and would recommend for that. And then finally, the last folder you're going to have is going to be that project name. If you don't have that project name in there, when you open up VS Code, it will just show whatever the topmost folder is. So maybe this is could name your project web or name of the client web or whatever, or maybe it's this web or something. You can put a name in there so that way it shows up in VS Code how you would be able to distinguish it between another VS Code folder. So yeah, just know this one's optional, but just know whatever your top level folder is, that's what you're going to see as your, by default, that's what you're going to see as your name of your VS Code instance when you have that open. So all right, so that's the kind of the first step, is where do I put my code? Now we get to the first step of initializing it. So I'm going to try to take you from I've got nothing and I'm going to get to a fully built project with unit testing and code that's webpacked together and ready to go. If you don't know what all that is yet, hold your horses. I'll get there, but I'm going to have to start at the beginning. So what I will do first is I will go through and get a page going up here and get some things running here. So let me go ahead and open up a new folder here. So I'm going to create a new folder here called Summit TypeScript. Cool. And then I will open up VS Code to that folder. Cool. As soon as I get my VS Code open. Okay, I've got my and I want to put a new folder here, a subfolder here. So this is going to be the name of my project. I'm going to just call this heck for this example here. And I'm going to open up my VS Code for that folder. Cool. All right, so we've got absolutely nothing in here at all. And we just need to see if I can even minimize that. There we go. So what we want to be doing here, kind of put these side by side here, is we're going to want to first install TypeScript. I've already done this globally in my machine. It's a -G means, so I don't need to install that again. But if you haven't installed it, npm will install it for you. That's great. You can keep it up to date with that as well. Simple change for that, but you're going to want to install that. And then this one is where we're going to use that NuGet.exe to install the XRM definitely typed library, and a library I wrote in addition to the XRM definitely typed that handles giving some additional features to that typing. So this is a library that's used or created by a company over in Europe, and they go through and connect to your instance and generate all your typings for your forms, and they have very, very extensive typings. I'll get into a little bit more information on that as well, but I'm going to go ahead and install those NuGet packages just to get us going here, and then go through and actually create my NuGet or my package.json file here. So let me grab some files here. I will open up my VS Code. Okay. So I'm going to go to terminal here, new terminal. By default, it's PowerShell. These are just command line prompts, so just be careful that you're using the right one. So this is the NuGet call to go install the NuGet package from Delegate. And then when that's done, I will install my little NuGet package as well. Okay, cool. So everything's installed. It's in the correct folder. And I can then initialize my package.json. So here I'm going to run npm init-y here. I think we should be good here. Cool. So I created this package.json file. That's start. What is this package.json file? So we kind of need to go down this rabbit hole of what it is. It's like if you've never used the JSON stuff, not used the JavaScript stuff, it's equivalent to C# package.config, but it's used for the npm projects. So this is where it lists what things you're referencing, and also some scripts here. So what you're actually going to go through and create for your scripts, like if you want to build, if you want to test, if you want to lint, if there's any command lines you want to run, if you want to regenerate your typings, you can create little scripts that it will run, and these are stored in this package.json file. Dependencies. One thing that's kind of interesting to call out here is that there are dev dependencies and non-dev dependencies. Just kind of realize that supposed to be dependencies are for anything that you will use at runtime. Dev dependencies are what you use locally or not in your server. So anything that doesn't make it to the server will go in the dev dependencies because it's not actually used at runtime. So that's kind of the rule of thumb. If you don't know, you can put everything in your dev dependencies if you want, or dependencies. But more on that later. Okay, so I'm going to install a whole bunch of packages. First, I have some ESLint packages, and this is what's going to be used to add some structure to our code and enforce structure for our code. So that's a primary reason for that. Jest is what's used to do some unit testing. Get into that too. Prettier is something that goes along with the ESLint as well. It's a little more opinionated. I'll get into that later. We have TypeScript here. So this is for Jest to actually go through and handle running TypeScript tests rather than just JavaScript tests for Jest. A loader for TypeScript, some Webpack stuff. This is what we're going to use to actually package our JSON, our JavaScript at the end. XRM mock is the unit testing framework that's in the community for JavaScript. XDT-form extension. This is my little extension that I'm using for the XRM definitely typed stuff that we get from the delegate stuff. And then finally, we have some TypeScript definitions. So if it starts as @types, that means it's a TypeScript definition. It doesn't actually give you any code. It gives you TypeScript definitions, which are used to give you IntelliSense, basically. So that means this stuff is not TypeScript, it is JavaScript, but it gives you definition for it, or maybe there's no JavaScript at all. So this XRM is the default XRM typing, not the actual, not the one that's used here, and I'll get to that later as well. But I'm gonna go ahead and just start running all these installs here. And I probably need to start this earlier, especially if I'm gonna be running this on a hotel Wi-Fi. We'll see what I can do there. But I'm gonna go ahead and install all these things. So it's install npm install -- save dev, so that'll save everything to my package.json, and then I have all these packages listed one at a time. So I'll just run through it and let that process here. Okay, so while that's running, the other thing we need to do is we need to create our TypeScript file. So this is the file that's used by TypeScript to determine what files is it going to compile, what files is it going to look at for typings, and all that kind of fun stuff. So let's go ahead and open that up. Or run that, and then that's still running. So I kind of have to wait for that to run. Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and run that. Cool. So this created my tsconfig here. You also notice my node modules. This is everything that got downloaded from npm, whole bunch of stuff. And then the tsconfig here is going to be what's actually the files used, or the settings that are used for the for TypeScript. I believe I have that already created, so I'm just going to go grab that one if I do have it. Maybe I don't. Let's see. And no, I don't. Okay, cool. So some files I'm going to change here is I'm going to change the output directory of this thing. So there should be an output. And I'm going to change this to web resources /hex/JavaScript. So my formatting for what I do is I have everything go into web resources folder. So if I have any JavaScript that needs to go somewhere, I could put that. If I'm all my JavaScript created from TypeScript will go from here. And then my prefix or whatever my prefix for my not profile for my solution provider, whatever that prefix is, goes there as well. And then I have everything, JavaScript, CSS, whatever subfolders from there, whatever folder structure you want to use. But I do recommend having this one and this one. That way, when you deploy everything, it's deployed in your own separate folders. You don't have to worry about any naming collisions. If you have a web resources /common.js, it's very common for somebody else to have that as well. Or of course, you have to have a prefix. I guess it would be like new_common.js. But yeah, so that's the way I go through and organize that into those subfolders, and that helps for deploying it. I don't have to do any weird mapping. I just create it how it needs to get deployed. So that's one thing. Other thing to do is I'm going to update the include down here. I believe there's an include in here. Include. It's not include. So I'm going to add an include here. And that says, hey, grab everything from this source folder and from this typings folder. So we're going to have typings that are going to have the type definitions and the source folder in order to generate my TypeScript. There is a whole bunch of other settings here on this type checking. You probably want to enable most of these things, I'd guess, if it's a brand new project. If not, you may not, but yeah, there's lots of extra typing that'll help save you in certain areas. There's other stuff that may make you more annoyed than anything else. So just be careful how you use that. So so those are two things updated. And me update. Oh, and then also let's update the ES to, well, I'll use 2020 here. Okay, let's use that version of the ACMAScript standard. And then yes, that type checking section, you may want to go through and add any types to there, whatever suits your particular flavor of how you want to actually enforce typings within TypeScript. Okay, so that's the TypeScript setup. Now let's go ahead and get to the linting setup here. So for those you don't know, linting is basically a static analyzer to go through and analyze the code base and hopefully find bugs that are common stylistic errors. Okay, so the other one we're going to use is Prettier. Prettier is forces the actual coding style, and it's purposefully not very configurable because it's trying to eliminate the argument about which way things are created. Are they tabs? Are they spaces? Like, rather than give you an option, it just forces a standard. So you just go, hey, we're going to use whatever Prettier is, and we will learn to like it. Like, that's kind of the idea, rather than having to fight for days about, we need to put the curly braces after the function. I want to put it on the next line. I want to put it here. Like, it just is a standard and defines it, and you don't have to argue it. You just go, okay, let's just stick with Prettier. So, so that's what I'm using. Also found this out as well. There is a VS Code settings to auto format and save. That makes your life way easier. Google it if you don't know what that is to see how to do that. I found that out the hard way because I kept on getting errors, and like you go right click and say fix this Prettier error. Got annoying where I figured, hey, I could just auto format it just by clicking save, and that made my life a whole lot better here. So linting. So now we need to actually configure on linting, configure the settings we want for our linting. So linting has settings. Prettier really doesn't have a whole lot. It does have a few. We'll walk through those, but let's go ahead and do that. So the next one I'm going to run here is this npx. Let's see if I can show that at least. Yeah, not really. This npx ESLint. Did it? There it goes. Cool. So this is going to be a little like wizard to walk through. Hey, what do you want to do? I'm just going to click enter for this. I'm going to click enter to this. I'm going to say I'm using none of these things. That I do use TypeScript. It does run in the browser, and I want to just enter for the JavaScript. And then it says, hey, you need these typings. I believe I already got it installed. I'll click yes anyway, just to run through and do that. Yep, up to date. Yep, so I didn't have to install anything. I already installed that. And now we have a ESLint rc.javascript file here. Okay. So that's just generating that from scratch. You can create your own from scratch, but let's go ahead and see. Oh, and then you can also run this to actually go through and lint your project and automatically apply any fixes as well. So that's kind of a neat command line to have. But let's go through kind of the updates that we want to do here. So if I look at this, environment's good. Hey, it's going to run in the browser. 2021, ECMAScript's fine. And then extends is something we are going to want to update. So in the extends section, I'm going to update this to use the prettier extensions here. So in this order, something didn't like something. Why did it not like extend? All right, cool. So didn't like it because I put that in and applied the prettier settings and said, hey, I need to format that. So yeah, so that's why that happened. Cool. So that's extends. That includes the prettier stuff, and this order does matter, I think. So make sure you have that in the right order. Next stuff to walk through is some of the ignore patterns. So I usually ignore these config patterns just because it seems kind of weird to be always including those, and sometimes it does some weird things to it. So I'm adding that to my ignore, which I don't have yet. So ignore patterns, great. And now you see that, hey, this thing is, now we don't have any of those errors anymore. So cool. Yeah. And then the parser is the TypeScript ESLint parser. That's good. And then we have some parser options here. Those are good as well. And then plugins. So I'm going to include the TypeScript ESLint plugin as well as the prettier plugin for that. And then what else do we have here? Rules. Yeah, this one can get me. This is my one thing that I don't like. This is saying, hey, you can't use any anywhere. I don't like that. So that's one that, because sometimes I just say, hey, get out of my way, TypeScript. I know this is okay, do that. And so that's the one rule that I am turning off, is to say, hey, let me use any. So anyway, now this is an explicit use. It doesn't allow implicit uses, so I mean, it's still okay that way. So save that, and cool. Yeah, so that project, that should be set up for ESLint now. Checking the time, we're halfway through, 22 minutes, great. Prettier. So I'll walk through what prettier is. It's a little bit different than a linter. Linter is going to try to figure out any issues statically and apply some formatting. Prettier is all about that code formatting and all about applying it all the time, and not giving a whole lot of options. Like these are, I think, all the options available. Maybe there's a couple more that are a little bit different, but yeah. So these are the options that I'm just going to enforce here. The primary one here that you want to definitely worry about, especially on Windows machine, is end of line. If you don't have that one on, it's going to think the control line feed is an issue, and it should just be new line rather than a line feed or something like that. So yeah, that's one that's kind of important that bit me the other day. So I'm just going to go ahead. I already have that file defined, so I'm going to go ahead and get back to my terminal here. I'm going to go ahead and just copy that file over. So now we see our prettier.rc in here, and it contains all the files in here. Good there. Okay, we've set up all the basic stuff that we need to now actually begin to do the typing. So feel like we're going really fast here, and it's probably going to continue to feel like you're going fast. So if you need to stop and ask me questions, feel free. But let's continue here. So I have to start this with talking about the great XRM typing divide, I'm calling it. There is the delegate XRM definitely typed, and then there is definitely typed XRM. Thankfully, at least they are slightly different named, and the XRM is the beginning versus the end. Definitely typed XRM comes from the definitely typed open source library, and it contains typings for almost every single JavaScript library in the world, basically. Like now granted, you don't use a whole lot of extra libraries when you're doing Dataverse, CDS, Dynamics, CRM, whatever name you want to use, development for forms and stuff. But every single one I've ever wanted to use has had typings already defined for it. So that's amazing. And this is the one that's the most community-driven one that is used for most open source projects that I've seen. The other one is this one that's used that's actually going to actually give typings based on your metadata. So it does my thing as well. So it's okay for the JavaScript API. So it will generate an API that you can then use to make API calls in a type-safe manner. It's a little bit different than what you would think. You have to pick out your actual type you want to use as the first parameter, and then all the typing after that's like set up. So it's a little bit different how it works, but it makes sense, I think. And it does require generation. So if you're used to doing the early bound generation for your C#, this is the early bound generation for your XRM definitely typed. And this is more of your late bound. Even though it is typed, it's not going to apply the typing for you. You have to apply it. And it's, again, we'll do it form specific. So each form will have its specific typings. The definitely typed version, now again, I'm going to use this as XDT for shorthand, just to distinguish between the two, and definitely typed if you're going to work with the definitely typed XRM library. But this is great for the actual JavaScript API. Oh, I'm sorry. I said web API. This is the JavaScript API. So this is the form API, basically. I don't actually like some of the typings in this as much as this for a lot of the form stuff. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. I kind of like some of those better, but you can use both with what I'm doing and how I handle that. So don't worry about it. You can have them both play along fairly nicely. You just got to cast from one to the other whenever you want to use that or decide that something else is better. So, but there is no generation required for this. It's just the types. You have to define what it is. So it's kind of late bound on that approach. So there's no form specific generation. And again, this is what is used by most frameworks in the wild for XRM, for Dataverse, especially the one that I'm using for this one is XRM-mock. So you have to have it for that one. So you have to make sure your naming collisions don't have any naming collisions between those two definitions. So let's walk through actually configuring this. So we actually downloaded the XDT generator, basically this delegate.xrm-definitely-type.exe already downloaded. And it has a config file. And in that config file, we need to go through and update some values here. We need to update the URL, username and password. Now you don't have to enter these in. You can actually type these in as part of your command line parameters if you want to. For now, I'm just going to put it in my config file. Excuse me. And then where we want these files to go. So mine, I want to go into typing/xdt. The entities you want to have. So if you have more than one entity or multiple entities you want to generate forms from, you can list them here. If you want to generate everything, you can do that too. That seems a little bit overboard. So I put in the entities I want to generate. And then this one here is what do you want the web API to be called? So for me, I just XDT query is my preference. You can do whatever you'd like, but that's the one that I'm using, XDT query. And then where do you want those libraries to go? That source.lib is where I'm putting that in there for those libraries to be able to do the web API calls in that type-safe manner. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that in. I've already got that configured elsewhere. So let's just copy that in. Copy it in here. All right. And okay, so that was the config file that got copied over. And now that the config file is copied over, we're going to actually run the code to generate this. So I'm going to run two of them here. The first one is XRM definitely type.exe. Again, this is going to connect. It's going to actually go and generate your types. So if I look at our source folder here. So it's under this packages, and here's the XRM definitely typed, and here's my post processor. This is open source as well. This was written in was it F#? So I don't know that language, and so rather than trying to extend that one, I just wrote a little post processor to handle it afterwards. So that's why you see the naming for that. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit that exe and let that run. So let's go back. So this is going to connect. Hopefully it doesn't have any issues. Cool. All right. Goes through and it's generating the stuff and creating all of our files. And then when that's done, I will then run this other exe. This is mine to give a little bit more typing information. So what we have here is created this typings folder. And this source folder, the first source folder, this is the library that they use in order to do web API calls. So they have the regular full JavaScript version. They have a minified version, and then they have a version for prod, which is a promise version. I'm sorry. So this is like a version for doing the promises. So anyway, I generally just use this one right here. This one, the promise version, is injecting a promise library as well. Okay, so you can use this one if you want to. Normally I just stick with the minified one. But that's the library for that. And then it also creates all your typings. So if I go to form, account, I'll see, different account formats here, main, and then here is the account form, the main one. You'll see it has tabs. You will see the tabs have sections on them. You will not see the sections having attributes, so or controls. So that's one thing you won't see that they don't generate. Collapse some of these things. And finally, then you'll see, hey, here are all the attributes, and this is how the typing works. If you've never seen this before, it's going to give a string literal type to here that says, all right, if you give me a name of address, a string literal name of address1_city, then your return type will be an attribute of type string, or null potentially. And so that's how all that typing is created. So when you go and call get to go get something, you'll actually see, hey, this is the type that's being returned, and you'll find that in your IntelliSense. So it generates all that, and same thing for controls. So you get all the control names as well, and then we have tabs, and then again some other information here as well. Get attribute. Yep, so this is on the get collection, and then this is the get attribute collection. So this is like the shortcut method for that. So we have to define those in both places. So that's what they generate out of the box. What I generate is this little extensions block here. And in this extensions block, one thing I didn't forget to mention, there is also the settings that I pass in. So this is where we're actually going to generate the file, where the files actually come from. That's a typing set, the XDT, and then where I want to grab the files from as well here. So those are two paths that you have to pass into that processor. Forgot to mention that. Okay, here we go. So what I do is I also extend this, and I do this kind of weird thing here where it will go and define for the account this form attributes type. And so this is basically a grouping of either all the attributes, Boolean attributes, date attributes, lookup attributes, multi-select attributes, number attributes, option set attributes, and string attributes. What that allows you to do is to be able to find a function on the library that says, hey, this function applies to all form attributes of type date, let's say. So maybe it's a get some date string, get a printable date or display date. So you can have it apply only to attributes that are of type date. So that's the way to do that. And same thing with controls, all those are set up, and then this is the way it basically goes through, reads all those things and combines them to figure out, hey, here are the Boolean names, here are the lookup names, and all that kind of fun stuff. The other stuff that it does is I hate having to do the .get attribute, add-on change. I just want to have a .add-on change on my context. And so that's the extra stuff that I add to this to make my life a little bit easier. So I've got an add-on change and a get value that kind of handles that for me in my library. But because the types that are returned are not, they're a little bit complicated, I guess I'll say, I've defined them here rather than using this method to define them in my base forms. But I'll get into that a little bit later as well. So that's what gets generated. Those are all my typings. So now I have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of typings. Web API typing. Granted, this is probably my area where I need the most improvement. I mean, just yesterday was the first time I actually used the tool to generate a create web API call. I've just been doing retrieves till then, and there's some things I still don't think I quite have settled because of some joins. I'm having issues with that, and I have to do fetch XML. So I've got room to improve here. But you may want to use Scott DeRoe's library instead, Dataversify or Dataverse-Iffy. I'll ask Scott when I see him next week what it is, I guess. But so you may want to use that one. Maybe it's a better one. Maybe it's not. I do know it's much more C-sharpy. So if you're used to the SDK for C#, it's going to feel much more aligned to what you normally have. But I've never used it. Maybe it's a mistake I've never used it, but I've never used it. This is the one that comes by default. I've only used it in one project. The good thing about this one is you don't have to do more type generation. You do it once for your forms, and it also does your XML query stuff as well, your web query as well. So that's kind of an advantage of it. That's why I'm kind of sticking with it and seeing how it goes. But just as an example of what the difference is here, here we'll await a retrieve multiple for the account. So here's you're defining what type I'm going to use. And then you can select and filter, and in here you will have IntelliSense of the account. So I'm going to have x.account number, comma, whatever, and then it'll return back something that's x.account number. Same thing with the filter. You have IntelliSense in here for at least this part. Obviously, the value you're sending doesn't have IntelliSense, but the attribute does. So that's the XDT's version. Dataversify has this retrieve version, so this looks a little bit more XDK-y. I didn't have retrieve multiple because Scott doesn't have an example online, but hey, the opportunity with this ID, give me these values. So, and then you cast it as the type you actually want to return. So this one you use this to cast it, this one you manually cast it. So whatever. Okay, so we've done all this work. Let's go through and actually start using some of it. So I'm going to walk through some of these forms here. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a form base, big base code stuff. I'm always big on base classes. So here's a form base that helps to define my forms for me, makes it more standard, makes me to be able to allow to have unified logging or whatever I want to do. This comes from my XDT form extensions npm package. So just as FYI, but this one I'm creating this one so that way on this project or on your project, you can extend it however way you want, and I can change this without breaking you or vice versa. You've got your own version there, so you don't have to update you can't update this stuff, you can update that stuff. So just a layer of separation. Then we'll create the actual form. It's TypeScript itself. So we're going to inherit from our form base, and we're going to give it, hey, this is the form. Here are the form attributes. Here are the form controls. If you wanted to use a JavaScript file that does more than one form, you could union these types together if you wanted to. But those are the attributes and those are the controls. And you can import form base here. And then I have this little onload that's static. This makes it way easier to create it or to register it in CRM. And then I have the on initial load. So this is just by default, copy paste for each one basically. And ideally, you'd pass in the foreign name as the first parameter to your onload, and then all of your registering of your on event handlers and your on saves would happen in the actual JavaScript or TypeScript file itself for that form. It is done via a promise, so you aren't going to hold up the loading of everything else on the form. So that's one thing that Microsoft does some documentation on. Say, hey, beware of using the add-on, doing a lot of stuff in the onload that prevents your form from loading, but since it's going to be called asynchronously, that should allow other code to operate while you're setting your stuff up. So just FYI on that. And then for this one, I'm going to do something silly here, but for the description on the account, I'm going to set the value to totally awesome example. So I will go ahead and let's copy those files over. So now I have my form, count, and base. And I also created a test file. So let's take a look at that. First, we got to configure it. So this is setting the Jest configuration for this. Did that get brought over already too? May have. Yep. So I brought in over this. It says, hey, my root is the source folder. I'm testing a node. Use TypeScript Jest as the way to test stuff. And my format here is the form. I've got a form folder to match my form TypeScript folder. And then whatever the file is, I've got a .spec on it. They don't have to match those naming conventions exactly, but that's what I'm doing for this. And here's basically the test file to go ahead and test with. I'll go ahead and get that here. All right. And I think we have an issue with the, this is the error I was getting with the control here. With this, I may need to restart my VS Code to get that to not yell at me. Okay, so and ideally I want to test that too, but I'll get into that when I reload it. Okay, problems. I think we're okay. Maybe. Okay, cool. Now we're okay. Yay! All right. So that's pretty or not loading correctly. Sometimes if you get those kind of ESLint or TypeScript errors, sometimes just reloading VS Code will have it refresh its cache and work. So this is the test. If I wanted, I'll walk through the test here real quick. So we will go through and describe, hey, this is going to be a profile form test. Actually, it shouldn't be profile, that should be count. Anyway, I'll update that later. I define the context to be, hey, this is the account form context. It's also this extended form context, which is from my library to say, hey, this does more than just the base form. The base context does. I also define a form that I can then reuse for every single test method, and I first initialize the form. So this mockgen.initializeForm is a library that is in this XTT form extensions that will take the typings that are listed here and then generate a mock form based on that. So I don't need to go through and say, all right, I need a description field. It just automatically will go through and create that based on those typings. That also means that if you happen to remove something in your form, you'll actually get your test to fail because it's initialized from those typings. So good typing, a lot of heck typing of your TypeScript. Create the form, just passing this little mock. Here I'm using it as any. I'd have to cast it to a very specific thing, and this is just easier for that. It's a form. I will then await the form to load, and then I will also have the context set as well. Now in here, I can go through and do a test. Hey, on load of the form, since the load has already happened here, I should expect this description to be set to, here it says totally legit, so it's going to error. We'll fix that later, but that's the test. Deploying the code. There's this whole rule about packaging or not packaging, or just plain on JavaScript files. This first attempt is just throwing files out there and then doing whatever's required to include those in wherever you need them. So you can go through and define dependencies in Dataverse, but those dependencies are not honored outside of JavaScript. So if you have a PCF control that's using it, or a web page, it's a web resource that's utilizing that, it won't load correctly. So just be aware of that. But this is kind of what, if you start off with day one, dynamic loading is what I used to use. I'm not convinced that it's bad. And maybe it's better for load times even. It seems to be a little bit easier to build, so I don't have to worry about doing all this extra loading. But it just loads at runtime rather than later. And there's you have to fight with it sometimes to get to work with some libraries that aren't configured correctly for dynamic loading. So it's probably easier to step away from it. So that's good. But everybody's using Webpack, so I guess this is what you need to use. But it basically will combine all the files that are needed, just the ones that are used, into your actual file for you to upload. So to configure Webpack, you need to use the config files for, and there's more than one config file. So I'll give you a little page here to say, hey, this is the config file for, but you should have a shared, a prod, and a dev version at the very least. So that way you can build for dev or build for prod and not have duplicate settings in each. So I have an example here. If you want to go look at those, great, go ahead and look those. But then once you build those, then you can push the Dataverse using your tool of choice. I recommend the Web Resource Manager. So you just load the actual Web Resource folder and select the files you want to push and say push and publish, and you're done. And you can also configure it to support TypeScript and map files, so you can get full IntelliSense of your TypeScript when you're debugging something in your environment. So let me go ahead and get the Webpack config moved over. All right, so that's my Webpack config. I have dev, prod, and share. So there's not much in the dev and the prod besides dev is not minimized, and then prod is a setup of, hey, how are all these things running here? So you have to define every file you want to create. So every form you want to have a file for, you'd add it to this forms array here. If you have web pages, web resources, you can add it here. On ribbons, you can add it here. And the reason they're separate is because they get pushed to different directories, and they'd have different names for it. But the end process is going to have like a heck.form here. So when you go to actually push it, your onload would say, all right, I'm going to pull from js/forum/contact.js, and the name of it is going to be heck.form. And then the name of the actual library, so maybe profile form, and then .onload. That's a function you're going to have enabled, parameter, and then the information. So that's all you have to do to actually configure it. So that's all those things. And then here's some stuff that I had to do to get the external query and filtering logic to work correctly, because those don't play very nicely, unfortunately, with NPM and Webpack. And so this is the configuration that I found that works to go through and make sure that these references can be included into your TypeScript files with all of the appropriate logic associated with that. And finally we're getting to the end here. I'm actually at 47 minutes, so this may be interesting. We had to stop early, but creating the scripts. There are scripts here that you need to do, or that I set up. Format script, lint script, regen scripts. This is where we generate your typings for you. Test script, test watch. It's like you can save your file and see changes working. Build for dev, build, and then a start server.dev. So I am going to go ahead and copy over the scripts into my npm package.json. Cool. Now I can do npm run test, and it will go through our test, and it should fail because we have that name being different there. Runs. And it passed. It should set the description. Why did it pass? Expect the description to be totally legit. I go to the actual page itself, which is this thing. Oh, it is totally legit. Okay, cool. And again, cool part is test.watch. You can edit your file and see how those changes are working. So it's going to run through that, and each time I save the file, it's going to rerun that and check to see if anything's changed. So make it a little bit bigger. So if I go back to my account form here, and I change this to something else, save, it should fail. All right. Hey, look at that. It doesn't have to do anything. And yeah, so you can do test-driven development, which is awesome. Finally, what have we done? We've got typing for every single form. We have every single attribute listed. We have all the context functions typed. We have mocking set up for testing to be able to have that as well, and typing for the web API. So any of this stuff, I didn't get a chance to show this, but I can do like this .context get attribute if that's common, right? But what about if I want to do add on change, and then I have all the IntelliSense for all these, whatever it happens to be for that stuff, or maybe I have a set value, and we'll do this address line 1, and it knows it's a string. If I pick something that's not a string, let's see, credit limit. We should see that this is actually a number here. So you get errors if you do something wrong. If I make it a string, it yells at you. So all your IntelliSense is built in, which is awesome. And it's all type definitions, so they don't actually get deployed, which makes it even better as well. My libraries are all mul safe, so if you happen to have more than one form and one form doesn't have the credit limit on it, it just ignores it. It says, oh, it doesn't have it. It'll log it. Hey, you've tried to set credit limit, and it doesn't exist in the form, but it won't throw an error. It'll just keep on running. So yeah, so all this stuff is here working. All the typing's working. It's just a wonderful, wonderful way to TypeScript the heck out of your projects. Any questions? I will go ahead and stop the recording now, but that took just about 50 minutes. I believe I have 40, so that'll be great.
Yeah, good luck. I think the workstation setup was a bit long.